Discernment Digest is not a political podcast, even though I've personally been interested in politics since I was 11, and I watched the Watergate hearings with my father the summer of '73, just months before he died. From then on, I've read and thought about law and government and politics, and have become one of tens of people in the country who watches C-SPAN regularly. So although this is not a political podcast, I have many political anecdotes to illustrate how the discipline of discernment has been mostly abandoned and explains how we've now come to embrace people and things we would have viscerally rejected just a few years ago. The current state of our politics is a useful illustrative tool, not for the politics itself, but because politics is downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of religion. That is, religious belief informs cultural values, at least some of which demand political power to enshrine. A religious belief in the sanctity of all human life by enough people can create what John Paul II called a, quote, culture of life, and that cultural value can be given the sanction of law via politics with the regulation or even abolition of abortion, the vigorous prosecution of human trafficking, and the protection of the human person from the scourge of pornography and prostitution. But if the connection between religious belief, cultural values, and political power is severed, then the power is service of what we value, however the value was acquired. If our values are not based on transcendent beliefs, then they're embraced for other, by definition, lesser reasons, like popular sentiment manufactured by so-called influencers. Francis Schaeffer recognized the crucial role that worldview plays in culture and politics when he said in his book, A Christian Manifesto, quote, "Christians have gradually become disturbed over permissiveness, pornography, the schools, the breakdown of the family, and finally abortion. But they have not seen this as a totality, each thing being a part, a symptom of a much larger problem. They fail to see that all of this has come about due to a shift in worldview. That is, through a fundamental change in the overall way people think and view the world and life as a whole," close quote. What has caused so many Christian people to tacitly approve in our day things we would have eschewed just not very long ago? So although Discernment Digest is not about politics, politics highlights what it is about. And unfortunately, we do not have to look far for illustrations of the egregious behavior that now passes muster for professing conservative people. Just 2 days before this podcast will be released, our president posted on social media a video making the proof-free claim that the 2020 election was stolen, and at the end of which, and apparently unrelated, there were screenshots of former President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle depicted as apes. Immediately, protests, defenses, excuses, and flip-flops began, with mostly predictable knee-jerk reactions taking shape along political lines. Opponents of the president decried the pictures as clearly racist. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said it was from a larger video that used characters from Disney's Lion King to depict all kinds of people as animals, including the very white Joe Biden. But the problem with that is there are no apes in Lion King. So that explanation was abandoned, and the president himself has said it was a staffer who accidentally included the Obama ape video, and we were later told that video of the Obamas came up in the staffer's video feed via algorithm. Now, you know how algorithms work, right? Your internet traffic is tracked and recorded so that you can be presented with more and more stuff that fits your profile. That is, stuff the algorithm thinks that you'll like. So who is the staffer, and why does the algorithm think they'd like Obama ape videos? And why does such a person work for our president? And more urgently, why does such a person still work for our president? President Trump says he didn't know it was there, and he's since taken it down, in part because of what I said earlier, namely that the reactions to it were mostly predictable. Mostly, but not entirely. You see, it was so bad that even some Republicans spoke out. African-American Republican Senator Tim Scott, a potential vice presidential running mate for Trump in 2024 before J.D. Vance was selected, Scott said this: "Praying it was fake because it's the most racist thing I've seen out of this White House. The president should remove it." The president has since removed it, but not before being asked whether the staffer would be fired and whether he, the president, would apologize, both of which, as of this recording, he has declined to do. One of the religious beliefs that became a widely held cultural value in the politics of Republicans for nearly all of my life has been personal responsibility. If I posted a video given to me by someone else, yes, that person would be held accountable, but I also would take responsibility and apologize. But you know, that is just so 15 years ago. Two more anecdotes will hopefully suffice to make the point that we've come a very, very long way in a bad cultural and political direction. A direction abetted by religious conservatives like us, so that we then can pursue an understanding, hopefully, of how we got here. The release of this episode will be about 9 hours after the Super Bowl and what has become its infamous halftime show, this year featuring Bad Bunny. I'm told Bunny is indeed bad. Now, I never watched the halftime show since soft porn is against my religion, so I'll take the word of others whose consciences allow such stuff to clue me in. Thankfully, for prudes like me, Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, has come to the rescue, and they're doing their own halftime show for conservatives of a sort. And this family-friendly version is headlined by a guy named Bob Ritchie, but you may know him by his show name, Kid Rock. Our Vice President J.D. Vance was all excited. He posted on X, quote, "Fantastic lineup for the TPUSA halftime show, including the great Bob Ritchie, a.k.a. Kid Rock." Now, I confess that I've never listened to a Kid Rock song. And when I looked into his family-friendly offerings, I'm quite glad that I haven't. I'm not going to repeat the filthy stuff this man has said on stage, but suffice it to say his songs are deeply immoral, with some talking about interactions with children. Speaking of, I've come to realize that one reason I've been appalled at the lack of character of our president more than most of my Christian friends is because we're talking about two different guys. They know him as the guy portrayed on Fox News for 2 decades, and on a show that I never watched, but of which I've seen clips, called The Apprentice, which starts to the tune of "Money, Money, Money," as he disembarks from his private plane, sits at the head of an executive suite conference table, looks every bit the man in charge, and famously tells people, "You're fired." Many have noted that The Apprentice, in its 11 seasons, gave many the impression that this man is presidential material. But I'd never seen it, so I'd never seen him that way. And as I said, I think we're talking about two different guys. I didn't know about The Apprentice, and I'd bet many of you did not know this. Now, if you're listening on the way to school with your kids in the car, then perhaps turn it off and come back later. I'd bet most of you did not know that Donald Trump was a regular on Howard Stern's New York radio show before he was president. Howard Stern is an awful human being who regularly spoke in the most raunchy sexual terms. Stern and Trump would banter often about those themes, including, incredibly, Stern commenting to Trump about his daughter Ivanka, saying, "She's a piece of," to which Trump responded, "Yeah." Oh, and one more thing. You probably didn't know that Melania, who Franklin Graham has called, quote, the classiest first lady we've ever had. Did you know that Melania used to be a model? You knew that, but did you know she was a nude model? And did you know that she was a nude model with other nude women? And there's been a documentary made of her life that's in theaters, and Pastor Robert Jeffries of First Baptist of Dallas is so excited that he posted on social media a picture of what he called church ladies from his church in evening gowns, all dressed up and excited to watch it. Now, I'm going to take a break and get a shower, as I feel dirty just recounting this stuff. And there is so much more. Not least a decades-long friendship with child abuser Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not saying Donald Trump was a child abuser. To my knowledge, there's no evidence of that. Just being friends with a guy for that long is enough for me. So I'm thinking we're often talking about two different guys because the good Christian people I know would not be fans of the one I know. We may vote for him, but we could never promote him. Okay, that's just some of where our politics are, but my claim is that politics is downstream of culture and culture downstream of religion, worldview. So how did we get here? It's because we have failed the first requirement of discernment, namely discerning who and what to give your ears and eyes. Having done so, we fall and prey to the warning of Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. J.B. Phillips' famous and accurate paraphrase is, do not get squeezed into the world's mold. And yet we have. How? Well, let's go back in time a bit, shall we? Day was when conservative Christian people did not frequent movie theaters. Preachers preached against them as worldly, and many in the fundamentalist and holiness movements like me came to adopt separation from the culture. The idea being if worldlings do it, it must be worldly, and worldliness is wrong, so stay away from the movies, the music, the dances, the fashions. In short, stay away from culture. The confusion of culture and worldliness was an error in discernment, and it came at a cost. Biblically, worldliness is a subset of culture because not all that culture does is worldly. All worldliness is cultural, but not all that is cultural is worldly. For example, our cultural norms surrounding weddings, many of them are not worldly. They're participated in by non-Christians, and they have overlap with what Christians do. This false dichotomy resulted in fundamentalist and holiness Christians having their own separate movies and music and fashions. By the way, no dancing. Meanwhile, evangelical Christians, that is, as we will see in a history that I'll start to recount in the next episode, evangelicals versus conservative Christians, but not of the fundamentalist variety. Those who sought to maintain a theological conservatism but cultural relevancy, they ridiculed the fundamentalists. And while they were right to avoid the fundamentalist era of isolation, they inadvertently moved toward the era of accommodation. The more they modeled cultural forms in vocal style, in dress, in language, in entertainment, the more tolerant they became of the worldliness that was indeed embedded in those cultural forms. The worldly evangelicals, as author Richard Kebido called them, adopted a kind of reverse legalism. The fundamentalist version of legalism they rejected was, whether caricatured or real, it was, if the Bible doesn't explicitly say you can do it, you cannot. And they traded it for a more culturally accommodating, if the Bible does not explicitly forbid it, you can. I think you can see how both approaches diminish or eliminate the need for discernment. I can either do it because the Bible says I can, or I can do it because the Bible does not say I cannot. But the Bible's not written in that way. It certainly has rules and laws, but it also has principles to be applied in various circumstances and across times and cultures, which is why Romans 12 and verse 2 says, "Do not get squeezed into the world's mold," without detailing all that might require, because worldliness looks different from one time and place to another. For example, the meaning of cultural expressions changes over time. I would argue that at the advent of rock and roll music, especially a few years after in the 60s when it was associated with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, those worldly associations were enough for Christians to refrain from forms that promote such things. Over time, though, what cultural forms connote shifts. Certain kinds of dress and fashion can, for a period of time, connote worldly expressions or do so in a particular location, but not at other times and places. The same holds true for cultural customs. For example, when I visited India a number of years ago, I saw men holding hands. I was told by my host this is an expression in India of friendship, not of homosexuality. So here's what worldliness is. Worldliness is fallen values expressed in culture. Fallen values expressed in culture. I said earlier that worldliness is a subset of culture. Not all culture is worldly. So we have to discern the values that are being expressed in a particular cultural form. Is it fallen values or Christian values? But please understand that what you tolerate in moderation, the next generation will excuse in excess. And over time, I'm absolutely convinced, and I've lived long enough to actually witness it, that that is indeed what has happened. I said last week that there are preconditions to acceptance of the disinformation with which we are today bombarded. We didn't arrive at this place overnight, not after one election or two, and not due to one politician who's exceptionally good at it. No, we've been primed over years to accept things and people we should have rejected immediately, but instead we chose to listen and often then have been deceived. The first requirement of discernment is to whom and what you give your mind, and we've often made unwise choices at best. Religion gives rise to culture, which gives rise to what we do in our politics. The religious landscape for the last 100 years, from the beginning of the fundamentalist movement in the 1920s, the rejection of fundamentalism by evangelicals in the 1940s, and the morphing of conservative evangelicalism into worldly evangelicalism in my lifetime since the 1960s has led us to what we tolerate in our politics because of what we tolerate and emulate culturally. And that all based on our failure to be driven by a worldview, which is why I have said for years, you will either consciously adopt your values from Scripture or you will unconsciously absorb them from the culture. We've absorbed worldly forms of ministry, relentlessly marketed to us by what I call the evangelical industrial complex of preachers, musicians, publishers, programs, conferences, schools, clubs, studies, podcasts, and on it goes. The change that we've seen in the last 10 years may seem abrupt, but its way has been paved by many compromises over many years. I'll leave you with just one contrast to show how far we have fallen in our failure to discern. In 1992, when Bill Clinton won the presidency, conservative Christians of all varieties, fundamentalist and evangelical, denounced him as morally unfit for the highest office in the land. We were right. He disgraced the office with Monica Lewinsky's scandal, but our denunciations were long before that even happened, based on well-documented philandering on Clinton's part, to which he all but admitted in a famous 60 Minutes interview with his wife and future First Lady Hillary, in which Bill said, quote, "I've caused a lot of pain in my marriage," without going into detail. At the time, William Bennett, former Secretary of Education under President Reagan in the 80s and a champion of moral virtues. In fact, he wrote a book I have on my shelf called The Book of Virtues, and he wrote another called The Death of Outrage, Bill Clinton and the Assault on American Values. But less than 20 years later, Bennett found himself endorsing Donald Trump for the presidency. An unrepentant, thrice married, serial adulterer, and more. And Bennett was far from alone, as evangelical icons such as James Dobson of all things Focus on the Family lined up to offer their endorsements. Our toleration now for what we once rejected is due to a long moral slide that shows up in culture, but also a very important theological error, embraced and promoted by the very evangelical warriors we chose to follow, namely the error that we, Christians and the church, have to win here and now, whatever it takes. In the next episode, I will trace the development of the fundamentalist evangelical divide and begin to look at the aberrant theology that led us to the win whatever it takes approach. If you'd like to contact us with a comment or a question, you can do so at our email address, discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.